At her retirement party, her boss leaned in with a smirk. "Your pension won't last you a year," he whispered. By Monday, her name was on the deed to the building his firm rented. 8 years remained on his lease. Every month, his rent would land in her account. She'd spent decades working under him. Now, he worked under her roof. And when the first invoice arrived, it came signed by his new landlord. "Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe." I smelled the sugar before I saw the cake, thick buttercream under buzzing fluorescent lights, the kind of coffee sweetness that coats the tongue and hides the aftertaste of duty. Balloons bobbed against the drop ceiling. Someone had taped up a "Happy Retirement Judy" banner that folded a crease through my name where the air conditioner kicked on. 35 years reduced to sheet cake, paper plates, and a flimsy plastic knife that bowed on the first cut. "Speeches?" someone chirped from accounting. Laughter, the practiced kind. I held the edge of the conference table and watched the reflection of Johnson Square shimmer in the windows, live oaks outside, Spanish moss lifting in little halos when the wind nudged them. Across the square, wrought iron balconies framed the view like picture corners. In here, framed photos from years of company picnics leaned on the credenza, faces I'd trained coming and going in seasonal t-shirts. Rick waited until a cluster of junior associates drifted away. His cologne hit first, sharp, expensive, and overconfident. He angled his shoulder toward me, cutting the room down to a corridor where only I existed. "Your pension won't last you a year," he whispered, mouth smiling for anyone looking, words hitting my ear with a dry snap. My first instinct was to blink. I didn't. I nodded as if he'd offered me more cake. My palm flattened against the cool laminate as if a handrail had appeared. In the window, my reflection kept the same expression I'd perfected over decades, pleasant, neutral, unbreakable. "Rick," I kept my voice soft, "save your advice for people who ask for it." He didn't hear the warning buried in there. He rarely did. If he'd ever listened, half the fires in this place would have never sparked. Kendra, stationed at the reception desk like a glossy lapdog, caught my eye and smirked. She'd picked a dress the color of a polished cherry, held a flute of sparkling wine she wasn't supposed to have at 2 in the afternoon, and wore satisfaction like a brooch. "Big plans, Judy?" she called, a little too loud, so heads turned in the hallway. "Cruises? Craft fairs?" Her look said, "You won't afford the nice ones." Ellen, sitting on the arm of a chair in the corner where the best gossip had always settled, lifted one eyebrow. Her hair, silver and unapologetically curly, lit up under the fluorescent grids. She had a paper plate balanced on her knee, fork untouched. When I met her eyes, she winked slow, like a semaphore flag. I knew that signal. "I see you. I see him. Don't move yet." Someone from marketing cleared their throat dramatically. "A few words?" they prompted, holding up a plastic cup as if I owed them a toast for the privilege of paying out my own retirement. "I'll go first," Rick said, stepping up as if the room had pulled him forward on wires. He planted his hand on my shoulder in a faux paternal way that used to make interns mistake control for guidance. My shoulder stayed stone. 35 years, he boomed. "Institutional knowledge you can't buy. We'll miss your attention to detail." Laughter. He told a story about me finding a typo on a contract in 1997. He mentioned how I always remembered birthdays. He didn't mention the times I'd saved him a lawsuit by catching the subclauses he didn't understand. Those stories didn't make for cake. "Thank you, Rick," I said when he finally ceded the space. That was thorough. I stepped into the center of the room and every sound softened, the copier down the hall, the ding of the elevator, even the traffic on Bull Street. My hands were steady around the cup. I waited a beat for the AC to kick off so I wouldn't have to speak over the air. "When I started here," I began, "we used carbon paper and ashtrays." A ripple of laughter. Some of them looked at me like I was describing the Civil War. I learned a lot about work. I learned a lot about people. I learned that you can tell a lot about an office by the way folks treat the person who orders the printer ink. A couple of heads dropped. And you learn what lasts. The habits you build, and the way you look folks in the eye. Kendra's smile thinned. As for me, I love this city. I glanced at the window where Johnson Square spread in green and iron. I love walking past these buildings and knowing who keeps them upright. I let that hang, the smallest emphasis on keeps. I'm grateful, truly. That's it? Someone muttered, disappointed there wasn't more sentimentality to chew. I lifted the cup. To good work done right, to leaving on time, and to finding out what else I can manage. Chairs scraped, plastic clinked. The cake made another trip around. A junior associate pressed a card into my hand, their cheeks anxious pink. I set it gently on the table, ran my thumb along the envelope seam and didn't open it. Rick edged close again, under the cover of congratulations. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he murmured, so quiet it barely pushed air. He patted my hand like a bank teller counting out pity. "You never do," I said, and felt Ellen's gaze land on me like a lifeline. "Walk with me," she said a minute later, low and easy, appearing at my side like we'd choreographed it. "Air's better out there." We stepped into the hallway, the carpet swallowing our footsteps. I could still hear the laughter growing louder in our absence, as if the room had been waiting for us to leave to let out its breath. Down the corridor, I passed the framed evacuation plan I'd memorized a lifetime ago and felt a small, private smile edge into place. I knew exits in my bones. "You hear him?" Ellen asked once the stairwell closed behind us with a soft latch. Oh, I heard him. The smell of hallway paint mingled with the lemon of industrial cleaner. Through the narrow window, a sliver of Johnson Square flashed bronze in the sun. Ellen's voice dropped to a conspiratorial murmur. "Then you'll want to hear me. Don't react. Just tell me you're free for coffee tomorrow morning. 9, my spot." I looked at her and saw the glint that only shows up when someone has been waiting for the perfect time to hand you a match and a map. "Coffee?" I repeated, light. "I suppose I can afford that." Ellen's smile cut across her face, quick and certain. "You can afford a lot more than that." The stairwell door whipped open below us. Kendra's laugh floated up, sweet and brittle. Somewhere above, a contractor's drill chewed briefly and stopped. The city hummed through the walls. I lifted my phone to check the time, the screen lighting my palm, and found a single new text from Ellen, already there like she knew I needed a prompt. "Tomorrow, 9. Bring your calendar. I have a thought." I slipped the phone into my bag, smoothed the sleeve of my blazer, and pressed my fingertips against the rail, cool and solid. "Judy?" Rick's voice came from the conference room doorway behind us, pretending casual. "Don't forget your plaque." I didn't turn. "Leave it on my desk." Ellen looked at me, eyes bright, all business now. "So," she said, the corners of her mouth barely moving. "Ready to talk about leverage?" I hadn't planned to give any answer here, within earshot of the people who'd already written me off. I let the quiet stretch until it sang. Then I lifted my chin toward the window, where the wrought iron across the square caught the sun like teeth. "Ask me that again," I said. "Tomorrow." And when the elevator dinged and the doors slid open, we stepped in without looking back, straight into the blank space where the next move waited with its hand out. The little cafe on Bull Street was already warm with the smell of roasted beans when I pushed through the glass door. Morning light poured through the tall windows, laying stripes across the hardwood. Ellen was at her usual table near the back, half hidden from the sidewalk, but with a clear view of anyone coming in. That wasn't by accident. She didn't wave, just lifted her mug in acknowledgement as I slid into the chair opposite. The steam curled between us, and for a moment neither of us said anything. "You didn't sleep on it," I said, noticing the neat stack of papers by her elbow. "I don't sleep on good opportunities," she replied. "And this one's not going to sit around waiting for you to finish a crossword." She turned one of the sheets toward me, a property listing photo in muted tones. I recognized the wrought iron balconies immediately. My old office building, Rick's Kingdom. "Tom's thinking of retiring," she said, voice low enough that the espresso machine's hiss almost covered it. "He's owned that building longer than you've been running Rick's circus, and he's tired." I took a sip of my coffee, slow. "And you know this because—" "I know everybody," a glint in her eye, "and they talk when they think you're just another harmless retiree eating a scone." The listing photo felt heavier than paper. I imagined Rick walking those halls, smug in the belief that he owned the ground under his shoes. What's the catch? No catch. Long-term lease on the top 2 floors. Rick's firm is the anchor tenant. She slid a finger across the lease summary. 8 years left, strong rent, strict payment terms. The kind of stability you don't turn down. Sale price? My voice didn't change, but my pulse had its own ideas. Ellen smiled like she'd been waiting for me to ask. For you, I can get you first shot. Tom respects you, remembers you running that place like clockwork. He likes clean transitions. I leaned back, staring past her to the street. A delivery truck idled by the curb, driver tapping the wheel in time with a song only he could hear. I'd have to run numbers, I said. Of course you would. And you'll like them. I pulled my tablet from my bag, fingers quick over the screen. My pension statement came up first. Predictable, steady. My savings account had been building since before Rick learned to tie his tie. The investments I'd kept through the housing crash were now fat with quiet patience. Ellen watched me scroll. You're in better shape than most people half your age. You know that? Doesn't mean I gamble it away on a whim. This isn't a whim. It's math. I thought of Rick's whisper the day before. You won't last a year. I almost smiled. You'll want to loop in Graham, Ellen added. Make sure you see the whole picture. By the time I called his office, I could hear the scratch of his fountain pen through the phone. Commercial real estate, he said, as if I'd just told him I'd taken up archery. Steady income, appreciating asset, and in your backyard? You'd be foolish not to explore it. I'm not looking to be a landlord chasing rent checks. You won't be. You'll be holding the paper on a rock-solid tenant who can't leave without bleeding money. Sounds like your kind of quiet revenge, Judy. I didn't correct him. When I hung up, Ellen was watching me like she already knew my answer. Outside, the square was waking up. Dog walkers, tour guides corralling groups under shade, the air thick with the smell of blooming jasmine. Think you can get me that first meeting with Tom? I asked. Her smile widened, sharp and pleased. All ready set for Tuesday morning. And Judy? Yes? Wear something that says you're not just retired. You're hunting. The way she said it, I felt the first spark catch, small, bright, and promising to spread. Tuesday morning came dressed in crisp spring air and sunlight sharp enough to make the old brick buildings along Johnson Square look freshly scrubbed. I arrived 10 minutes early, long enough to make sure I could stand on the sidewalk and take in the building from a distance. 4 floors of history, brick and iron, every window reflecting the green canopy of the square's oaks. Tom Albright emerged from the lobby a few minutes later, tall and deliberate, with the easy walk of someone who'd been carrying keys to this place for decades. He wore a sport coat the color of wet sand and a tie just loose enough to say he wasn't meeting a banker today. Judy, he greeted, his handshake warm, palm calloused in a way that said he still handled things himself when they needed doing. You're looking good for a woman who supposedly just retired. I like to keep moving, I said. Then let's move. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of polish and the kind of cleaning solution that costs more than it should. A mosaic floor in faded blues spread out under our shoes. The brass elevator doors gleamed, but the call button stuck for a second before lighting up. Little quirks, Tom said, noticing. Nothing that can't be handled. We started at the top. 4th floor, high ceilings and wide windows looking out over the square. A few law firms had carved the space into tidy offices. I could see Rick's reception desk just past the glass door, his company's name etched in a frosted panel. The carpet looked newer than I remembered, but the baseboards had a fine line of dust. Tom kept his voice casual. They've been solid tenants. Always pay on time. Lease runs 8 more years. 8 years. Long enough for me to make plans no one in that corner office would see coming. On the 3rd floor, another firm occupied the space. Smaller, quieter. A coffee maker hissed in their break room, the smell rich and tempting. Down the hall, a window frame needed repainting, the wood just starting to splinter at the corners. I noted it without comment. We moved through the 2nd floor, then the 1st. Street-level offices, a lobby space that could use a brighter coat of paint, and a small storage closet that Tom admitted hadn't been touched in years. Every flaw I saw was minor, fixable. Back in the lobby, Tom stopped near the elevator bank. "You've got good instincts," he said. "This building's in better shape than most its age. Needs a steady hand, someone who sees the value, not just the rent checks." "I see both," I said. "That's why Ellen thought of you." We stepped outside, and the sunlight hit us full on. The iron balconies above caught the light like fine jewelry. I pulled my notebook from my bag, flipping to a page where I'd started rough calculations. Even conservative numbers, after taxes, insurance, maintenance. The rent alone from Rick's lease would exceed my pension by a wide margin. The other tenants were gravy. Ellen was leaning against the corner of the square's fence, arms crossed, sunglasses hiding everything except the slight curve of her smile. "Well?" she asked. I closed the notebook. "It's instructive," Tom chuckled. "I'll get the rest of the documents over to you. No rush, but you'll want to decide before I make it public." As he walked away, Ellen pushed off the fence and fell into step beside me. "You ran the numbers." "I did." "And?" "They work." Her smile sharpened. "I thought they might." We paused at the edge of the square, the building rising behind us like a challenge. Through one of the fourth-floor windows, I could just make out the movement of someone crossing Rick's office, unaware of the woman standing on the sidewalk, already holding the shape of his future in her mind. I didn't say a word, but I knew Ellen could hear the answer forming in the quiet between us. The credit union's glass doors sighed shut behind me, muting the hum of mid-morning traffic. The place had the sterile scent of paper, ink, and faintly burned coffee from a break room no customer would ever see. I'd been a member here for decades, long enough that the manager, Lorna Whitby, greeted me like a cousin she actually liked. "Retirement treating you well?" she asked, walking me to her office. "I keep busy," I said, "and I've got something in mind that'll keep me busier." We sat across from each other, sunlight from the high windows catching in her hair. I slid my folder across the desk, pension statement, savings balances, investment summaries, all neat and in order. Lorna skimmed them the way only a banker who already knows the ending to the story does. "Based on this," she said, tapping a page, "we can pre-approve you for the amount you'd need without hesitation. But honestly, Judy, you could do this in cash if you wanted to." I shook my head. "I like my cash where it is. Leverage someone else's money first." Her mouth curved, like she appreciated the strategy. 10 minutes later, the pre-approval letter was printing, the paper warm when I slid it into my bag. From there, it was a short drive to a one-story brick house on the edge of the city. My first rental property, bought in the late 80s when interest rates were cruel but the bones of houses like this were worth betting on. The current tenants had been good, steady jobs, never late on rent, but I'd been up front. An offer had come along I couldn't pass up. They took the news with a shrug and a handshake. We agreed on 60 days. By Thursday, the for sale sign was in the yard. By the following week, it was under contract for more than double what I'd paid. Clean exit. Graham's office was as I remembered it, lined with old law books whose spines had faded to a uniform tobacco brown. He read through my notes without a word, then uncapped his fountain pen like a priest ready to bless a deal. "We'll keep this offer tight," he said, drafting language that was all teeth and velvet. "No contingencies you don't control, and a closing date that makes sense for you, not them." The offer sat on his desk like a sealed secret. I could feel its weight in the room. Meanwhile, Ellen was working her own angle. "Appraisals tell stories," she told me over the phone. "The public ones for the bank, the private ones for you." She had a guy, quiet, thorough, and with no interest in gossiping about who'd hired him. By the time he finished, I had a 40-page report on my desk, complete with photographs of every inch of the building. Not a word of this touched Rick's radar. I was careful. Meetings at the credit union first thing in the morning, when the square was still empty. Calls to Graham taken from the back corner of my own kitchen, not from a cafe where someone might recognize my voice. Every email went through my personal account, and nothing was printed unless it stayed in my locked drawer. If Rick saw me at all those weeks, it was in passing on the sidewalk, me with a grocery bag or a library book, him on the phone, not giving me a second thought, which was exactly how I wanted it. When Tom called one evening, his voice was steady, but there was a note under it, like a man who's just decided to put down a load he's been carrying too long. "I meant what I said," he told me. "First right of refusal is yours. I've had some nibbles, but no one serious yet. You've got until the end of the month to make it official before I list it." I looked across my dining table at the neat stacks: appraisal, pre-approval, signed offer from Graham ready to go. The sun was dropping outside, throwing long bars of gold across the floor. "I'll have my answer to you before then," I said. Tom chuckled. "Somehow, I think you already do." When the call ended, I sat back, the room warm with late light, and let the thought settle. The building was already halfway mine. The only thing left was to take the rest. Graham's office smelled faintly of leather and the faintly metallic tang of fountain pen ink. The blinds were half closed against the late morning glare, stripes of sunlight cutting across the stacks of contracts on his desk. My purchase agreement lay in the center, a clean white island in a sea of brown legal folders. "Everything's here," he said, sliding it toward me. "No surprises, and I made sure the language leaves you in control from the day we close." The pen in my hand felt heavier than it should, but my grip was steady. One signature, 2 initials, and the building was no longer just an idea. It was a countdown. Tom arrived a few minutes later, his own copy already signed. He carried a thick envelope that landed on Graham's desk with a soft thud. "Every tenant lease," he said. "Consider it your welcome packet." The paper smelled faintly of copier toner and the dry dust of filing cabinets. I thumbed through until I found Rick's. Even without reading, I knew the weight of it. 30 pages of obligations, renewal terms, and penalties that could bleed a firm dry if they tried to leave early. Halfway down page 12, I found what I was looking for. No early termination without liquidated damages equal to the remaining rent. 8 years. My pulse ticked once, sharp. Ellen appeared in the doorway like she'd just been passing by, though I knew better. "You'll want a quiet title search," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "I've got a guy. Works fast? Doesn't talk?" Tom smiled faintly. "You've surrounded yourself with efficient people, Judy." "I always have," I said. While Ellen made the arrangements, Graham confirmed the closing date, 1 week from today. Tight enough to keep it quiet, fast enough to keep Tom from entertaining other offers. The rest of the morning blurred into signatures, initials, and the shuffle of papers changing hands. By noon, my bag was heavier with contracts and leases than it had been with groceries all year. I stepped out into the square, the air warm and smelling faintly of blooming azaleas. The wrought iron balconies caught the sun overhead, and across the street, I saw Rick walking with his head down, talking into his phone. His free hand made small, sharp gestures as if cutting through an argument. I didn't change my pace. He glanced up once, saw me, and gave the kind of curt nod you give a neighbor you don't really know. No suspicion, no second glance. To him, I was still just the woman who'd taken her sheet cake and left. Ellen, leaning against the railing at the square's edge, watched him pass. "A week," she said under her breath. "You'll have keys in hand before he knows who to complain to." Rick turned the corner, his voice fading into the hum of the city. I slipped my hand into my bag, fingers brushing the cool edge of the lease packet, and thought about page 12. About 8 years locked in place. The breeze off the river carried the faint clang of a ship's bell. Somewhere behind us, the courthouse clock began to chime the hour. A week, and in that week, the ground under Rick's polished shoes would shift, quietly, completely, until the first he felt of it was the drop. The square was still shaking off its morning haze when I crossed it, the oaks dripping sunlight through Spanish moss. The building loomed ahead, brick steady, iron balconies catching the light like they'd been polished overnight. Tom was already waiting in the lobby, a ring of keys dangling from his hand. "Thought we'd take one last walk before tomorrow," he said. The air inside held the faint tang of metal and the ghost of fresh varnish. Someone had polished the elevator doors. Our footsteps echoed in the mosaic-tiled lobby, the kind of sound that carries authority. We started at the ground floor. Tom pointed out the original crown molding, the way the light hit the window bays in late afternoon. In the corner, 2 men in khaki pants and polos moved quietly, snapping photos, running their palms along the marble baseboards. Contractors. Tom said in a low voice. Preliminary look at what a lobby refresh would run. I glanced around, picturing softer lighting, a new reception desk, maybe a fresh coat of paint in a color that said both history and intention. We were halfway across the lobby when the glass doors swung open, and in walked Rick. No suit jacket, just a pressed white shirt with the sleeves rolled up like he'd been in the middle of something important. He slowed when he saw me, the briefest flicker of confusion crossing his face. Judy? His tone was halfway between greeting and accusation. Just visiting, I said, letting the words rest there, unadorned. His gaze slid to Tom, searching for explanation. Tom gave him a genial nod, no elaboration. Right, Rick muttered, and headed for the elevator. His eyes lingered on the contractors for a beat too long before he disappeared into the brass box. From behind the curved reception desk, Kendra watched it all. Her lipstick was the same cherry red as the day of my retirement party, but the smirk was gone, replaced by a thin, tight line. One manicured hand tapped the desk in a slow rhythm, the other curled around a ceramic mug that likely hadn't been filled for the guests she was ignoring. I met her stare long enough to let her know I'd seen it, then turned back to Tom. Upstairs? On the second floor, the hall smelled faintly of paper and coffee. My heels clicked against the polished wood in a tempo I'd once matched to deadlines and closing dates. We passed closed office doors, muted voices, the sound of a copier cycling. Everything looked the same as it had for decades, except it wasn't. Not to me. On the third floor, sunlight streamed in from tall windows, pooling in warm squares on the carpet. Tom was talking about HVAC upgrades, but I was barely listening. I could feel the building in my bones now, its weight, its possibilities, the way its income streams would hum along quietly under my watch. We stopped at the landing to the fourth floor. From here, the frosted panel with Rick's firm's name was just visible at the end of the hall. I didn't walk toward it. Not yet. Instead, I rested a hand on the cool railing, the faint vibration of footsteps from above traveling through the wood. Somewhere in that suite, Rick would set down his briefcase and start a day in an office he believed was his domain. He'd have no idea that the walls around him were about to have a new owner, and that I'd be the one holding the keys. Tom gestured toward the stairs leading to the rooftop access. Want to see the view? I smiled. Not today. I'll have plenty of time for that. As we headed back down, the faint murmur of the contractors in the lobby floated upward, joined by the quiet staccato of Kendra's nails against her mug. The sound followed me out to the square, where the air smelled like sun-warmed brick and the faint salt of the river. Tomorrow, this would all be mine, and I already knew exactly where I'd start. By Tuesday morning, the keys felt warm in my palm. The deed had been recorded the day before, Graham's voice on the phone calm and certain. It's done. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a neatly stacked pile of envelopes. Each bore the same heading in Navy script, Notice from Building Management, and inside, a letter that walked the line between cordial and unmistakably official. It began with an introduction. As the new owner of 214 Johnson Square, I look forward to maintaining the standards you expect while introducing improvements that will benefit all tenants. I'd kept the language airy, pleasant. The second paragraph mentioned my contact information, direct and personal. The third noted that select common areas would see enhancements in the coming months. That was it. No threats, no hard edges. Just the kind of note you file away and reread later when you realize what you missed. Rick's was the last envelope in the stack. I slipped it into the bundle for the fourth floor, tucked the bundle into my bag, and made the short walk to the building. By mid-afternoon, the letters were in every tenant's hands. I didn't linger to watch them open them, but word travels fast in a place where people pretend they don't gossip. Rick's door was shut when I passed by, but 10 minutes later, through the glass panel, I caught him at his desk, holding my letter like it might burn through his skin. His jaw worked once, twice. He set the page down, read it again, then leaned back in his chair as if distance would make it read differently. From the reception desk, Kendra craned her neck toward him. "This has to be a joke," she muttered, not low enough. Her voice carried across the lobby. "You're telling me she—" Rick lifted a hand, sharp, to cut her off. I didn't break stride. The elevator doors opened, and I stepped inside, letting the polished brass reflect my smile back at me. By the time I reached the ground floor, Ellen was waiting near the lobby's front doors, a to-go cup in her hand. "You've stirred the hive," she said. "I only introduced myself," I replied. That afternoon, my phone buzzed with a number I recognized but hadn't saved, Rick's office line. I let it go to voicemail. 2 minutes later, Ellen's name lit my screen. "You'll never guess who just called me," she said without preamble. I didn't answer. "He wanted to know if it was true," she continued. "If you actually bought the building." I told him yes. Then I told him you'd already been in to see the contractors. "And Judy?" "Yes?" There was silence. Dead air. Like I'd just told him the tides were canceling themselves. I could picture it. Rick gripping the phone, the space between his thoughts and his next words stretching into something uncomfortable. "Did he hang up?" I asked. "Eventually," Ellen said, satisfaction threading through her voice. "But not before I heard him exhale, real slow, like someone trying not to sound cornered." I looked out my window at the slant of late light hitting the balconies across the square. Somewhere up there, Rick was sitting in an office that didn't belong to him anymore, reading a letter he wished he'd never opened. And this was only the beginning. The rent check arrived on a Wednesday, 1 day past due, no note, no apology. Just a thick envelope slid under my office door by the building's part-time runner. I opened it at my desk, the morning light slanting across the polished wood. The numbers matched the lease amount to the penny, except for the late fee. That clause, 3% of the monthly rent, wasn't negotiable, not in the document Rick had signed 8 years ago. I pulled the lease from the stack on my credenza, page 17 marked with a green tab, and set it beside the check. The decision wasn't emotional, it was arithmetic. I keyed the payment into the accounting software, clicked the box for late fee applied, and sent the updated invoice back upstairs. It took less than 10 minutes for Rick to come storming in. The glass door to my office swung open hard enough to bump the wall. He didn't knock. "This has to be some kind of mistake." I glanced up from my monitor. "Good morning to you too." "You actually charged me a late fee?" His voice was sharp, incredulous, like I'd insulted the flag. I swiveled the lease toward him with one finger. "Page 17, section 4, paragraph 2, your signature is at the bottom." Rick planted both hands on my desk. "We've been here for years without this kind of nickel and dime treatment." "That's because you paid on time before," I said evenly. "This month you didn't." From the doorway, a shape moved. Kendra, in a cream blazer and heels that clicked like punctuation. She stepped inside, laying a smile across her face like frosting. "Judy," she began, syrupy sweet, "surely we can overlook a single day? Things happen. Bank delays, holidays, you know how it is." I let her talk herself into a softer tone, the kind meant to draw someone into agreement without noticing. She leaned her hip against my desk, the faint scent of her perfume drifting in, eyes trained on mine. When she paused, I tapped the lease again. "The terms are clear. Late is late. The penalty applies equally to all tenants. I'd be remiss if I made exceptions." Her smile faltered, the edges stiffening. Behind them, Ellen sat in the armchair by the window, one ankle crossed over the other, a takeaway coffee in her hand. She'd dropped by for a chat and now looked like she'd been handed front-row seats to her favorite play. Her eyes flicked between Rick and me with quiet amusement. Rick straightened, his voice lowering to something meant to sound reasonable. "You could just waive it this time." "I could," I agreed, "but I won't." The silence stretched. Somewhere in the hall, a phone rang, then stopped. Outside, the branches in the square shifted under a breeze. Kendra pushed off the desk. "It's a small thing," she tried again. "It's a contract," I said. Rick's jaw worked. He glanced at Ellen as if hoping for an ally, but she only sipped her coffee and said, "Seems pretty cut and dry to me." For a second I thought Rick might keep pushing, but instead he took the invoice from my desk, folded it in half with deliberate care, and slipped it into his pocket. "Fine," he said. The word tasted bitter in his mouth. He turned on his heel, Kendra following a half step behind. When the door swung shut, Ellen let out a low whistle. "You didn't even break a sweat." I picked up my coffee, the ceramic warm against my hand. He's the one who signed it. Ellen smiled over the rim of her cup. Oh, I know. But I think you just made him realize who's actually keeping the lights on around here. Through the glass, I watched them cross the lobby, Rick's shoulders tight, Kendra speaking low and fast. Neither of them looked back. I didn't need them to. The point had already been made, and it was only going to get sharper. The first brushstroke of fresh paint went up on a Monday morning, pale cream replacing the dingy beige that had clung to the lobby walls for decades. The air filled with the faint tang of latex and the low hum of rollers against plaster. Electricians strung new pendant lights along the hallway, the kind that cast a warm, steady glow instead of the flicker and buzz fluorescence tenants had learned to tolerate. I'd chosen the timing deliberately, 9:15 a.m. after most people had settled in but with the day still stretching ahead. By 10, the sounds began to rise, the sharp whine of a drill, the rhythmic thunk of a hammer. They weren't loud enough to stop business, but just enough to intrude, impossible to ignore. On the 4th floor, Rick was mid-call when a contractor's sander hit the metal edging of the stairwell. I happened to be in the lobby when his voice spilled down the elevator shaft, sharp and muffled. "Can you hold a second? The rest was lost to the grind. The elevator pinged. Rick emerged, tight-jawed, scanning the ladders, drop cloths, and buckets like they'd been dumped there to spite him personally. "What's all this?" "Common area improvements," I said. "The lease allows for it. I have clients on calls." "You have walls that need painting," I replied, my tone polite, factual. "It'll be worth it when you see the results." His mouth opened, then shut. He turned away without committing to either a thank you or a complaint on record. Kendra, however, didn't bother with restraint. By midweek, she was leaning over the reception desk, voice pitched for maximum carry. "The dust is getting into the vents. We're all breathing it." She glanced toward a pair of junior staffers as though rallying them into an uprising. One of the painters, perched on a ladder, pretended not to hear. "OSHA should have a look at this," she added, loudly enough that it echoed. "Everything's within code," I said from behind her, and watched her shoulders stiffen before she turned. "But thank you for your concern." Her smile was brittle, the kind that cracks if held too long. The upgrades rolled on. By Thursday, the electricians had replaced every flickering bulb with warm LEDs. The new fixtures glowed steady through the halls, and the hum that had haunted the place for years was gone. I'd also greenlit a rooftop HVAC retrofit, energy-efficient units that would cut utility costs in the long run, but required a substantial upfront outlay. Per the leases, capital improvement costs were shared proportionally among tenants. Graham had drawn up the notices himself, language crisp and airtight. The envelopes went out Friday morning. I was in my office when Rick received his. The sound of the door to his suite opening reached me even before the knock. Sharp, 2 beats, more percussion than courtesy. He stepped inside, notice in hand. "You're charging us for this?" "Per the lease," I said, sliding my copy across the desk. "Section 6, Paragraph 1, capital improvements benefiting all tenants are shared expenses." "I didn't approve these." "You didn't need to. It's in the agreement you signed." His eyes skimmed the document as if searching for a loophole that had never been there. Kendra appeared in the doorway, arms folded. "This is outrageous." "It's efficient," I corrected. "You'll see the savings on your utility bill before the year's out." Rick's grip on the paper tightened, the page curling slightly at the edges. "You're making it impossible to work here." "I'm making it better to work here," I said. "The two aren't mutually exclusive." He stared at me a moment longer, something calculating flickering in his eyes, then turned without a word. Kendra followed, muttering something under her breath that I didn't catch, and didn't need to. When the door closed, Ellen, who'd been sitting quietly in the corner flipping through a magazine, looked up. "You're not just renovating a building, Judy," she said. "You're rearranging his entire sense of control." I smiled. "And we're just getting started." Outside my office window, the painters rolled another coat across the lobby wall, covering the last patch of old beige until there was no trace of what had been there before. The contractors had barely finished the last stroke of lobby paint when I sent the next notice: renovations to commence, 4th floor, Suite 401. Estimated duration, 3 months. Temporary relocation per lease terms, Section 8, subsection B. I timed the email for 7:58 a.m., just before Rick's staff arrived. By 8:12, the echo of his footsteps was coming down the hall like an approaching storm. He didn't bother with pleasantries. 3 months? You expect us to uproot the entire office for a quarter of the year? I expect you to comply with your lease, I said, sliding my own copy forward. My thumb tapped the relevant section. Temporary relocation for substantial building improvements, equal or greater square footage provided. This is my firm's space. Clients expect to see us here. Clients expect results. The location is secondary. By noon, my phone buzzed. Graham's dry voice was on the other end. Rick called. I sent him the clause, in writing. He didn't thank me. The move happened over the next week. Filing cabinets rolled on dollies, bankers' boxes stacked in teetering towers. The IT guy spent 2 days stringing cables in their temporary quarters on the second floor. Smaller footprint, no skyline view, and wedged between a tax prep service and an insurance agency whose waiting room smelled faintly of mothballs. On the day they moved in, I walked the hall once, slow. The frosted panel outside their temporary suite bore nothing but the generic 401B, vacant sign I'd instructed the building manager to reuse. Rick's branding would be reinstalled when renovations finished, if he lasted that long. It didn't take long for the downgrade to show. I caught the look on a client's face one Tuesday afternoon, confusion shading into mild disappointment as he scanned the second-floor directory. The receptionist at the insurance agency helpfully pointed down the hall. Kendra made sure everyone knew who to blame. By Friday, she was in the cafe across the square, voice carrying just enough. 3 months, she told anyone within earshot. We had the nicest suite in the building. Now we're stuffed into a closet because Judy wants to play decorator. I let the words wash over me when I passed her table. If she wanted a public villain, I'd oblige. Back on the 4th floor, plastic sheeting draped the doorways. The steady thrum of work boots on tile echoed through the empty corridor. Contractors hauled out strips of old carpet, their edges frayed and dingy after years under Rick's desk. Ellen dropped by one afternoon, leaning against my doorway with a paper cup in hand. They look like they're settling into the broom closet nicely. Temporary discomfort builds character, I said. And leverage, she added, raising her coffee like a toast. Downstairs, through the second-floor window, I spotted Rick escorting a pair of clients out. He gestured toward the stairs instead of the elevator, maybe to avoid the bright new lobby where my presence was a coin toss. His expression was tight, his smile mechanical. 3 months was going to feel like 3 years to him. And when the contractors finished, the space he returned to would be brighter, sharper, and undeniably mine. Rick came to see me on a Wednesday afternoon when the sound of nail guns from the 4th floor had gone quiet for the day. No Kendra at his side this time, just him, carrying the kind of careful composure that comes from rehearsing a conversation you're hoping will go your way. He closed my office door behind him. Let's talk about ending the lease early. I set my pen down, gave him the kind of attentive stillness that makes people fill the air. A buyout, he clarified. You'd get your space back sooner, I'd be out of your hair, and we both move on. I reached into the credenza, pulled out his lease, and opened it to the page marked with a blue tab. Liquidated damages equal to the rent for the remaining term, 7 years and... I glanced at the header, 4 months, plus penalties. He didn't mask his wince quickly enough. That's excessive, he said. That's the contract. He ran a hand along the arm of the chair, as if measuring whether to stand or keep trying. We could negotiate something more reasonable. This is reasonable, I said. When you signed it, you were the one holding the pen. For a moment, the silence stretched between us like a wire. He leaned back, calculating, then finally exhaled. It's cheaper to stay. It is, I agreed. And it's warmer in your current suite than on the street. His mouth tightened, but he didn't argue. He stood, straightened his cuffs, and left without another word. 2 weeks later, the renovations wrapped. The 4th floor smelled of new carpet and fresh paint, the kind of clean that made the air feel lighter. Floor-to-ceiling windows gleamed, Their glass washed until they reflected the square below like water. The contractor's ladders had barely left the lobby when the inquiries started. A law firm from Charleston called about expansion space. A local tech startup asked about short-term leasing for a project team. I walked them through the building myself, my heels clicking against floors that looked as if they'd been poured yesterday. When we sat down to talk terms, the new rate was 15% higher than before. They didn't blink. The improvements spoke for themselves. That same week, Rick's firm moved back into their suite. The new carpet was softer underfoot, the lighting brighter, the walls in a muted slate blue that made his heavy oak desk look almost antique. But the space was smaller than it felt before. Compared to the gleaming second and third floors, his corner office looked merely adequate. One afternoon, I passed him in the hall as he walked a client toward the elevator. His tone was practiced, but I caught the faintest flicker in the client's eyes, a glance upward toward the floors they weren't on. Ellen caught up with me later in the day, leaning against my doorway with that half-smile she reserved for moments she knew I'd enjoy. "He's starting to see it, isn't he?" "What?" I asked, though I already knew. "That he's not at the top anymore, not even close." I glanced toward the window, where the afternoon sun spilled over the rooftops. Rick might still have his name on the frosted glass, but the building, the decisions, the future, belonged entirely to me. And I wasn't done deciding what came next. The morning after Rick moved back into his suite, I took a fine-point pen and drew a small red circle around a date 7 years and 4 months in the future. No notation, no sticky note, just a quiet mark on my leather-bound desk calendar. That date wasn't a deadline. It was a finish line. The building was humming now, every floor except Rick's filling with fresh energy. The second floor had a boutique marketing agency with a lobby full of sunlight and mid-century furniture that looked straight out of a magazine spread. The third floor had 2 new law firms that paid their rent early and liked to host client mixers, which made the hall smell like catered hors d'oeuvres once a month. Higher-paying tenants meant more resources, and I reinvested quickly. Restored crown molding in the stairwells, replaced the cracked tile on the front steps, upgraded the lobby security system so the place felt like a private club. Everyone noticed. Everyone except Rick's staff, whose shoulders seemed to slope more every time I saw them. They shuffled through the lobby without the brisk pace they'd had before the move, smiles reserved only for clients they still had to impress. More than one looked wistfully at the glossy glass doors of the newer suites as they passed. By spring, Kendra's appearances had dwindled to nothing. At first it was working from home 2 days a week. Then one day I overheard one of Rick's paralegals mention she hadn't been in for a month. Her desk in the reception area sat neat and untouched, the chair tucked in like no one lived there anymore. Ellen and I took our usual table at the cafe across the square one sunny Thursday. She set a chilled bottle of champagne on the table with the label turned just enough for me to read the vintage. "Too early," I said, though I smiled. "Not for the drinking," she said. "For the reminder." I arched a brow. "You've got the date marked," she said matter-of-factly, "and when that day comes, we're sitting right here, watching from this exact table as he walks out of that building for the last time." I didn't deny it. The image had already been playing in my head, Rick carrying the last box down the steps while the square went on without noticing. Until then, my interactions with him stayed clipped and cordial. Lease renewals came with the same even tone I used for every tenant. Hallway encounters were reduced to polite nods. He never gave me an opening to gloat, and I never took one. One afternoon in June, we passed each other in the lobby. He was with a client, so I smiled just enough to be professional. He did the same. But I caught the way his eyes flicked to the polished directory wall where his firm's listing sat lower than the others, not because I'd moved it, but because the newer tenants had claimed the prime positions above. The square outside was loud with tourists that day, the sound of the fountain carrying on the wind. As I stepped out into the sunlight, I glanced back once. Through the lobby's glass doors, Rick was still standing there, staring at the directory like it had personally insulted him. The clock was running, and there wasn't a thing he could do to slow it. It was almost anticlimactic, the way Rick's last day arrived. No farewell party, no staff gathered to clap him out, Just a moving crew in matching t-shirts and the dull scrape of furniture being rolled across the fourth-floor hallway. From my office, I could see the elevator doors open and close, each time disgorging another piece of the life he'd built up here. File boxes, a coffee maker, that heavy oak desk I'd once thought immovable. Around midday, I stepped into the hall with a folder for one of the second-floor tenants. Rick was there, standing at the far end, watching the movers wrestle his conference table into the elevator. His gaze slid right over me as if by pretending not to see me he could make the day pass without my notice. I didn't stop him. Some victories didn't require a confrontation. By late afternoon, the suite was empty. Carpet vacuumed, windows bare, the air holding that hollow echo of a place that's been stripped of its purpose. I stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the sharp smell of fresh paint from the touch-ups, the light spilling across the floor where his desk had blocked it for years. Within a week, the new law firm moved in. Young partners, ambitious energy, and a client list that was already expanding. They brought in sleek furniture, glass-walled meeting rooms, and a reception desk that looked like it had been plucked from a design catalog. The lease they signed doubled the rental income for that space overnight. When the first payment hit my account, the number was enough to make me lean back in my chair and just breathe it in. A few days later, crossing Johnson Square with a folder under my arm, I spotted Kendra on the opposite path. She wore oversized sunglasses and a blazer a shade too bright for February. For a moment, I thought she might ignore me entirely, but then she turned her head just enough to meet my eyes over the rim of her lenses. The glare wasn't subtle, sharp, direct, and meant to land. I smiled, slow and polite, and kept walking. That Saturday, Ellen insisted we celebrate at the rooftop cafe she liked, the one with the wrought iron tables and view straight down to the square. She ordered peach bellinis without asking me first. "To the eviction you didn't have to file," she said, raising her glass. We clinked, the crystal catching the sunset. "To space reclaimed," I replied. She took a sip and grinned. "I've watched you play this slow game for years, but I've got to admit, this part is my favorite." Later that week, Graham stopped by my office, hat in hand like he'd just come from court. "Well," he said, settling into the chair across from me, "that's one for the books." "Which one?" I asked. "The one where the person underestimated gets the last word without ever raising her voice." I chuckled. "I've always preferred the last move over the last word." He nodded toward the window, where the new firm's sign was already gleaming in the late light. "And you made it count." The square outside was quiet, the kind of stillness Savannah only gets in the lull before evening traffic picks up. Somewhere across it, Rick was starting over in a smaller space, under a different landlord's rules. The thought didn't give me satisfaction so much as closure, because the building was mine now, entirely, without exception, and there were still floors left to shape. The ink was barely dry on the closing papers when the keys to the smaller building slid across Graham's desk toward me. A squat brick structure just off Broughton Street, 3 floors, newer roof, reliable tenants, and, best of all, a familiar name on the top floor lease, Bolton and Associates. I didn't need to hunt for them. They'd moved here after leaving my building, clinging to what dignity they could salvage. Now, without even shifting my chair, they were back under my watch, just in a different ZIP code. I left their lease intact, at first. No need to spook them with wholesale changes, but when the renewal notice came due, the updated terms went in. Tighter grace periods for rent, clearer maintenance responsibilities, and a clause requiring landlord approval for any subleasing. Standard stuff, really. But Rick's signature at the bottom would bind him tighter than the old handshake arrangements he'd been coasting on for years. The day the renewal packet arrived, Kendra intercepted me outside the front entrance. She was dressed in a tailored navy coat, and those sunglasses she seemed to think made her look untouchable. "This is petty, Judy," she said, waving the papers like they might burn her. "You're still chasing us?" I adjusted my bag on my shoulder. "I'm still managing my properties." "You've got what you wanted. Isn't that enough?" I smiled politely, letting the silence between us stretch. "If I wanted more, Kendra, you'd know." She hesitated, as if weighing the benefit of another jab, then huffed and stepped aside. The smell of her perfume lingered in the cold air long after she stalked away. Rick, on the other hand, said nothing at all. I saw him once in the hallway that week. He was coming out of his suite as I entered the lobby. Our eyes met for the briefest moment, and he looked away, the set of his shoulders heavy, his briefcase hanging lower than I remembered. He didn't slow down, didn't nod, didn't acknowledge me beyond that flicker of recognition. The rest of the building took the transition easily. Rent came in on time. The coffee shop on the first floor started sending me their seasonal menu ahead of each change, hoping for a landlord discount on their own lease. One evening, Ellen and I sat in my office at the Johnson Square building, the city lights reflecting in the windows. She leaned back in the visitor chair, a glass of wine in hand, and eyed the stack of folders on my desk. "You're running a portfolio now," she said, half teasing, half impressed. "I'm running it well," I replied. She laughed. "And to think you could have spent retirement crocheting Afghans." "That was never going to happen," I said, and we both knew it. When she left, I stayed behind, clicking through the new property's online portal. The accountant had already set up automatic rent collection for both buildings. No checks to chase, no excuses about postal delays. Payments would clear without so much as a knock on my door. The satisfaction wasn't about the money, though the numbers were better than I'd planned. It was about the symmetry, owning the building where he'd tried to outlast me, just as I'd owned the one he'd been forced to leave. The next morning, as I walked past the smaller building on my way to the square, I glanced up at the row of second-story windows. Behind one of them, I thought I saw movement, a shadow crossing the glass. I kept walking, my heels steady against the sidewalk, the weight of the keys in my bag a quiet, constant reminder. There was still one more play left before I'd consider the board clear. The quarterly reports landed in my inbox with a polite chime, the kind that used to signal more work. Now it signaled the opposite, proof that the work I'd already done was paying off. I opened the file, scrolling past columns of neat black numbers until my eyes settled on the bottom line. Between Johnson Square and the Broughton Street building, my monthly income was almost double what I'd made in my final years at the firm. The pension had been a safety net. This was a high-wire act with no risk of falling. I leaned back in my chair, the leather sighing beneath me, and let the numbers settle into my bones. Not just comfort, control, the kind of security that didn't depend on anyone else's permission. 2 weeks later, Ellen and I took the morning train to Charleston, the city sliding past our window in ribbons of marsh and water. She'd booked a weekend at an inn with balconies that looked straight over the harbor, the kind of place where breakfast came with silver pots of coffee and still warm croissants. We wandered through narrow streets lined with pastel facades and iron gates, so intricate they might as well have been jewelry. In the evening, we sat on the veranda with glasses of wine, the salt breeze carrying the scent of pluff mud and magnolia. "This," Ellen said, swirling her glass, "is why you don't crochet Afghans in retirement." The next Tuesday, back in Savannah, I spotted Rick crossing Bull Street as I came out of the bank. His eyes were down, fixed on the pavement like it might offer an escape. He didn't see me, or pretended not to, and I didn't call out. The air between us was long past needing words. I walked on, cutting across Johnson Square to the coffee shop in the Broughton Street building. It smelled of cinnamon and fresh espresso, the kind of warmth that made people linger. The barista knew my order before I reached the counter. "Your shop looks busier every month," I said as she slid the cup across. She grinned. New landlords made all the difference. I didn't correct her. Outside, the city moved at its usual hum, tourists photographing the fountain, a delivery truck rumbling past, the faint click of my own heels against the brick sidewalk. By late afternoon, I was back at Johnson Square, papers from both buildings stacked neatly on my desk. I finished the last email, stood, and crossed to the window. The sun was dropping, the wrought iron balconies catching the light like they'd been cast in gold. From here, the whole square felt like a stage I'd spent years quietly directing. In the glass, I caught my reflection, steady, unhurried, the keys to 2 buildings a weight I'd grown used to carrying. Some retire with a watch, I retired with the keys.